And we are going to a segment we like to call difficult questions. That really needs some kind of wacky music, right? So we don't have a lot of questions right now, but there were quite a few questions from the service before that I think would be really beneficial to our online audience. So
Yeah, I got peppered a little bit in the last service.
there were quite a few. So um, the first question is this: will we always understand the purpose for our suffering in this life? Or is there some suffering that we will only understand when we meet Jesus? Should we actively seek to understand the purpose behind all our suffering?
Well, yes, to the part where there will be components or parts of the purpose. There will be some purposes that we do not know and do not realize until maybe later on in life or even till the end when we're with Jesus face to face.
Yeah.
And really that's when we will understand everything. So there's going to be parts of it that we don't have access to. However, in every trial or period of suffering, there will be purposes that we can discern. The three that I mentioned here today, those are things that I believe in any circumstance we can find God working. We can find God doing those things in any circumstance where we are suffering. I believe that to be the case.
Yeah.
So we can always grab onto those things. We're not going to see the big picture always, but we'll get that which is enough to carry us through and to see God at work.
Yeah. Yeah, and thank you so much for that, Cody. And kind of related to that, hang on. Would you say that suffering is necessary or vital to grow as Christians?
So yeah, I do. And I think we see that in all sorts of things. There's 100 different analogies where we see that strength often comes through hardship. One of the analogies I didn't use last service, or I didn't use in the sermon, was the idea of pruning plants. You remove parts of the plant so that it grows stronger, not bears fruit or blossoms or what have you. It comes from causing that pain. You're removing parts, and then it is able to put nutrients to another part of the plant. Whenever you have to put pressure on something, whether you're building something, right, pressure causes something to get harder, to get stronger. It's just a fact of physics, right?
Yeah.
Or even in history, we see that, if people have suffered and had to fight war a lot, they have become stronger and more able to fight. And places where there are more peace and they let kind of their guard down a bit, what happens is they're more easily overtaken. The same thing happens in our life. And really, we're in a state of spiritual warfare, too, to keep that in mind. The more that we are kind of pressured or inflicted with hurt, we're able to grow stronger. We kind of learn what our weaknesses are, and then we cover those weaknesses.
Yeah.
So that's what happens in suffering, and it's vital, I think, to vital to growth.
Yeah, absolutely. You see this in like all of life, right? I mean,
Yeah.
like for example, I read this one article about plants, right? Like there's this farmer who uses 25% less water, but his plants are just as fruitful because they adapt to the pressure, right? To the water pressure. So that was a
And overall, in conditions, they would do better in hardship than the ones that
Exactly,
because they're
yeah.
adapted for it. Exactly. So
You mentioned that Hannah was putting her identity in childbearing abilities or in her childbearing abilities. So, what should her identity have been placed in? And could a shift in that have changed her experience in suffering?
yeah, that's a great question. And whenever we read, whenever we're in Scripture, we always have to be aware of the context. And we got to jump into Hannah's and Elkanah's ancient Near Eastern, ancient Israel context, and realize that they are adopting and they are kind of living with an understanding of life and identity that is not necessarily correct. Just
Yeah.
because they're in the Bible doesn't mean that they're completely holy or something, right? Hence the two wives. You're not supposed to, but in his culture, that's what they do.
Yeah.
And the same thing with her. I mean, in their society, right, there's obviously a great significant difference between a man and a woman, and a man's value over a woman, and her value and identity, and she believes this about herself,
Yeah.
is that it's wrapped up in childbearing.
Absolutely.
Now, we know that's not true. We also know through our faith, through our relationship with God, actually, that our identity should be rooted in our relationship with Him, in that alone. That's the source of our identity. Had she had that truth or held on to that truth in her earlier days, sure, she would have hurt from the rejection, from the lack of a child. In many ways, she would have experienced pain. but I think she would have been better able to handle it because her identity would have been rooted in a relationship with God, and it wasn't. But as we see her grow, and we don't get to see the full story of her life, it's not her biography or anything, our hope is that she grows to understand this, as in this period of her life, she realizes that God is the answer for her needs.
Yeah.
And hopefully that will spring forth more spiritual growth where she can do that.
Cool.
Could have been that.
Would you say that our society, and I'm guessing our Western society, is obsessed with medicating pain and suffering? And and could you give some practical and healthy ways to alleviate it?
Yeah, so the first question, my answer would be yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's the gist of it, right? In almost anything, any kind of message that we get, I find, is always some kind of run towards a pleasure or ease or convenience, run away from whatever is hard, difficult, painful. The good life is this, the bad life is that. And it really, it's in everything. There's some way to medicate and numb yourself from anything that's difficult in life, or an attempt to, I should say.
Yeah.
The first thing is to realize that. I think the first thing is to realize, we have this idea of hard drugs as being so, terrible to the body, and we kind of use that as an image. Realize how in the very acceptable things that we do in life, we are, in a way, kind of drugging ourselves, using it as a crutch to bear with life. Take those things away.
Yeah.
It can be even like, sometimes people eat, not to say like, a gluttonous sort of response to food, but even sometimes people have like small treats that they depend on for their happiness in some way.
Yeah.
Or, any other kind of convenience. And people just, naturally, it's okay that I'm on my phone. And really, it's a response to like stress in their lives, and they go on their phone to distract themselves. It's an acceptable behavior. Fasting is a good way to test yourself. Notice those things, look at yourself, and notice those things you're leaning on to make yourself feel a little bit better. Get rid of those things and replace that with God, and learn to do that as a regular discipline in your life, to separate yourself from those medications and find the true salve for our problems, which is God.
Yeah, absolutely. Fasting is, I don't know, I would call it a little bit of a lost discipline within the church. In some cases, it's like
it's a very lost discipline. Very lost.
I mean, in some churches, it's the other F word, right? It's pardon that joke, but yeah, absolutely. It's I found that fasting to be such a great discipline to practice, right, and great spiritual growth. And so, most of us, all of us, we have a ton of unbelieving friends. For most of us, it's like most of our friends are unbelieving, right? So we have a hope, right? We have a hope, like our suffering is for a greater purpose. How do we comfort those of our unbelieving friends, when they are suffering?
So, I think it's a special situation when we're talking about someone who's in pain and who is suffering actively. A lot of times we want to be able to just openly share and our relationship with God, our knowledge of Christ, and sometimes we want to be a little bold with people, right? Well, when they're suffering and hurting, there's a certain vulnerability in the air that makes that a lot more, a lot harder to do.
Yeah.
And not necessarily beneficial to do. And this is a time where people, I think, often are very, it says they want answers to things, but they don't want to be told things.
Yeah.
It's the time where if you're going to go and say something and you should do this or you should do that, even if it's friendly and loving advice, is more likely to get a rejection. Yeah. Yet at the same time, that person is probably seeking that answer more than usual. So I find, in my opinion, the first best thing is like anybody, is to really just come alongside and create a safe space for that person to be vulnerable. Let them know that you're available, that you're not going to, just give advice and tell them how to feel, tell them what to think, but to hear how they feel and to listen to their struggle.
Yeah.
And open up that and give that. Once you've done that and you create a relationship of trust with someone like that, they know who you are.
Yeah.
And they're searching for answers.
Yeah.
And I very much believe, and I've seen this in my life, where that's an opportunity when people actually will come and ask you questions. You know, whenever there's been, when someone has passed away in my family, people that, you know, I would have a harder time talking to, come, you know, I'm just there in the room and we're just, you know, like not really pushing anything or talking, just listening to people, and then questions start coming up. They know who you are, and then they're looking for answers. They'll want to ask.
Yeah.
It's creating that condition and being there for somebody.
It's just being available.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You know, we want to step in and talk, but this is probably the one time where that's going to cause a rejection of what you're trying to say.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So that's where it's a little bit flipped on its head in moments of suffering. We want to be there and be vulnerable with people.
Yeah. Well, that's all the questions that we have, and that's all the time we have for questions.